I begin with the year 1886, and that goes back a fairly long time. The year 1886, in the life of José Martí, is a year of enormous and fruitful activity. That could be said for almost any year of José Martí's life. It's incredible how much he put into every year of his working life. And 1886 is one of those great years. Because in that year, there appeared in a newspaper in Philadelphia, a newspaper called The Manufacturer, an article, an editorial that was titled, "Do We Want Cuba?" It was an editorial written from the point of view of the very acquisitive, domineering U.S. upper class. And in that editorial, they were saying that, well, Cuba can be a very important acquisition because we like Cuban cigars, we like the Cuban sugar, but we just don't like and we don't want the people of Cuba. It was a tremendously insulting editorial with regard to the Cuban people. And what was worse was that 5 days after that editorial appeared, on the 16th of March, 1886, the editorial was not just copied, but just intensified in a newspaper in New York, the Evening Post, and was made even more insulting editorial with regard to the Cuban people. José Martí wrote to the Evening Post a response that he called the vindication of Cuba. And he said, of course, among other things, that this kind of thinking can come only from people who are rampantly ignorant or excessively jingoistic. And he defended the Cuban people, and what he showed, most of all, the characteristic that he showed of the Cubans, was that they were able, they had already put up a war against colonialism in defense of their dignity, and there could be no expression stronger of the dignity of a people than to fight for their independence and their sovereignty. Martí later collected the two editorials, and together with his response, Vindication of Cuba, he published them in a little booklet to which he gave the title, and it is the title that governs our event of this afternoon, Cuba and the United States. It was very timely, that publication, because at that time in Cuba, among Cubans, in addition to those who genuinely wanted complete independence, there was a group of Cubans that were talking about annexation. The Cuba being annexed, and of course people in the some people in the United States were also talking about that. The annexation of Cuba to the United States. Well, Martí showed that it would be really disgraceful for a people to want, a Cuban people, to give up the fight for independence and sovereignty, and instead want to be annexed to a people who showed the kind of disregard for the Cubans that was manifested in those editorials. It was very timely that that should be done at that time, because it actually almost put an end to the quest for annexation on the part of Cubans. Marty was saluted, greeted by people in exile in the United States, in the New York area, and it was really a turning point, because few people at that time were talking about imperialism, talking about US imperialism. Marty was really the first person who identified US imperialism. And the editorials were examples, clear examples of this disgusting imperialism that he wanted to warn people about. And not just people in Cuba, but people throughout the Americas. Because at that time too, in 1886, the United States was organizing an international Congress of American states. It was the idea of the US Foreign Secretary. And they're inviting different countries, all the countries in Latin America, to attend this conference. Marty didn't really have standing to be at the conference or to participate in it, but he sought out this standing by making himself available to Uruguay, to be the consul for Uruguay in the United States. And in that capacity, he started a furious writing campaign, published a series of 12 articles in La Nación of Argentina, a newspaper that was really respectful of journalism in those times, and that had real prestige, genuine prestige in Latin America in those times. The conference, the Congress, was scheduled to start on the 2nd of October. And between August and October, Marty campaigned furiously against the conference, because he saw it as the symbol and the essence, really, of imperialist activity. And the continuation, putting into practice the Monroe Doctrine. Because the Monroe Doctrine was announced in about 1822, but it had remained dormant. But then Marty saw that this was bringing the idea of the Monroe Doctrine alive in his time, in this year of 1886. And so he brought to the attention of the people in Latin America the intentions, the imperialist intentions of the incredible energy at a time when he was not physically very well. It was in that period too, he finished the La Edad de Oro, that book that or a journal that he dedicated to children in Cuba and in Latin America, extolling the virtues of people who had really contributed to humanity and setting goals for these children of the Americas. He finished that work just at the beginning of October so that he could be ready to make himself known and to greet the delegates as they were arriving for the conference, and to continue his work of warning them against US imperialism, not to fall for this idea of a Congress of American states organized by the United States. That Congress or could be called the forefather of the Organization of American States, for example. And it's interesting to see how, thanks to the ideas of Martí that were continued through Chavez, through Fidel, the warning against and the battle against US imperialism has continued, and it has achieved victories. But Martí died some 9 years after that work of 1886, and died in battle, as we know. And the work of freeing Cuba had to be continued by others. It was not an easy work. It was not easy because the Americans had power, they had military power, military strength, and they were good at deception. They were good, for example, when they came into the war, the Cuban War against colonialism, against the Spaniards. They actually managed to get the help of the Cubans, the Cuban fighters. The Cuban fighters allowed US troops, for example, to come into Santiago de Cuba. And after they came in and they took charge, really, of Santiago, and they, we could say, won that aspect of the war against the Spaniards. Taking charge meant that they didn't give the Cubans the regard that they should have had. The Cubans would carried on this war of independence, a brutal, cruel war of great suffering, because the Spaniards had brought all their troops together, and sometimes led by the most vicious of generals and leaders. They made the Cubans suffer greatly throughout those wars. But then, when the Americans came in, and, for example, they said that the Cubans who had allowed them to come in and prepared the way militarily for them to come in, they decreed that the Cuban soldiers could not come armed into Santiago de Cuba. They put that imposition on them immediately. You remember that when Fidel came down from the Sierra to Santiago at the 1st of January 1959, with the victory of the revolution, one of the first things he said was that no one is ever going to allow us, stop us, prohibit us from coming armed into Santiago de Cuba. He is alluding to that ugly part of US-Cuban history. He also immediately too identified as the time of when he talked about the future, that he said in a letter that he wrote to his confidant Celia Sanchez. He wrote to her saying that you know, that the struggle from now on is going to be the struggle against the United States. It's going to be a harsh, tough struggle. And so it was. It has been. It's continued to be, because they've used so many devices. And when that editorial of 1886 had said that they appreciated certain things in Cuba, in this period, in the period, the neo-colonial period in Cuba, they really exercised that wish, that desire, by taking hold of Cuban property, Cuban resources, Cuban sugar, Cuban tobacco, Cuban, the infrastructure, the electrical means, the telephone companies, and so on. You remember that when the revolution took hold of those things, you remember Fidel Castro enumerating the different things that Cuba was now going to own. And there were things that were appropriated by the United States during that neo-colonial period. You remember, of course, Cuba was also under the control of the Platt Amendment that took enormous parts of Cuban territory. And remember the fight, the battle after Martí, in the period up to 1902, before a constitution and what was called the First Republic were established in Cuba, that there were Cuban heroes who fought. The heroes such as Juan Gualberto Gómez. Juan Gualberto Gómez tried to fight against the imposition of the Platt Amendment. He led a little group, a minority really, in the Cuban parliament, and to resist American control of those Cuban assets. At that time, the military governor of Cuba, Leonard Wood, was representing the new president of Cuba at the time, Theodore Roosevelt. And he was really irritated, this military governor, by the opposition put up by someone like Juan Gualberto Gómez. And he wrote to Roosevelt, complaining about what he called the stinking little Negro who was opposing. So these, there were Cuban heroes who continued that paradigm of the fight, the recognizing how difficult, how perilous it would be for Cuba to have something like the Platt Amendment. And of course, it has turned out to be just that, a hideous part of the control of Cuban territory, in the form of Guantanamo, for example. So those struggles have continued. The Cubans have had to use, and thanks to the genius of Fidel Castro, he's realized that the battle has to be won with ideas. A battle of ideas, he talked about constantly. And the United States had to be outwitted, outdone, by the ideas that were attractive not just to Cuba or to Cubans, but to people throughout Latin America and throughout the world. Ideas that have a basis in humanitarian philosophy. Being good to people. Good to your own people and good to people throughout the world. And these ideas are bearing fruit. And these ideas have brought what we might call the victory against US imperialism. Because the 17th of December of last year, at that time, the US, in a sense, declared their defeat to Cuba. But of course, the defeat is not going to be coming with an abrupt ending of US manipulations. The talks that are going on now to put away things like the taking Cuba off the list of terror-supporting countries, a list Cuba should never have been on that list. There's never has there been. Cuba's been the victim of terrorism constantly, and coming from terrorists based in the United States. And if diplomatic relations are to be established. Cuba is insisting. The delegation that arrived yesterday to continue the talks that were started on the 22nd of January this year, that delegation is led by Josefina Vidal, is very, very aware of the consequences of establishing diplomatic relations. Fidel has said that, of course, he doesn't trust the United States, but Cuba, we can trust Cuba to be vigilant, to be intelligent, and as I keep telling my friends, don't worry. Things are in great hands, in Cuba's hands. Thank you.